So, let's talk about a splendid little war, the Spanish-American War. Now, I'm using splendid little war kind of with air quotes and irony. Um, I personally don't think that there's usually very much that's splendid about war in general. But the fact is that as students who are looking at the documents and interpreting them, especially that speech that you have to read for this lecture, the fact is that many Americans thought that not only was the Spanish-American War a splendid little war, but that war itself was indeed splendid, and they're enthusiastic for it. But the Spanish-American War does give us a warning. And the warning is, be careful what you wish for, because you might get it, and it might not exactly be what you think it is. But before we get to that part of the story, we have to talk about why the United States finds itself in this improbable war with the Spanish Empire. So, also we have to explain something that's kind of bizarre about the entire war. In the Spanish-American War, spoiler, the United States goes to war against the Spanish Empire, at least on paper, for being a mean empire. You know, we become kind of like the police force of other people's empires. But then, immediately after the Spanish are sort of expelled from their overseas territories, what happens? Well, if you guessed the fact that the United States just takes Spain's place, you would be right. Maybe, to quote the Dark Knight trilogy again, you either die the hero or you live long enough to see yourself become the villain. Maybe that's that principle at work. Who knows? But maybe the answer is in some of the deeper reasons behind why the United States goes to war against Spain. Because yes, on paper, the U.S. goes to war because the Spanish Empire is mistreating its colonial subjects. But if you're not cynical now, you hopefully will be in a little bit, and you'll hopefully understand some of the deeper issues involved. I'm going to go over three big reasons for why the U.S. goes to war against Spain, and I think I order them from least convincing to most convincing. But I think that the least convincing reason that I'm going to talk about in just a second does say a lot, even though it's a little fuzzy. It's like cotton candy evidence. There's not that much that's substantial to it. But it does, I think, explain a lot for at least a few key individuals. So reason one is that there's a changing of the guard, or more specifically, a changing of the generations. So when the Spanish-American War breaks out in the year 1898, the United States has been at peace for almost an entire generation. The Civil War ends in 1865, and yeah, there's some smaller conflicts that raged throughout the late 19th century. There's the Great Sioux War, featuring, remember, Man Afraid of His Horses. There's the Battle of Wounded Knee. There's, of course, the coup that we just talked about in Hawaii. It's not that you have an entire generation that is at peace, but that's an impossibly high standard, even for us today. But we can at least say that the United States doesn't have an armed conflict that depends upon the reinstatement of the draft, where American society goes to war. Hasn't happened in almost 30 years' time. And you would think that's a good thing, right? And me personally, not to be too biased here, but I kind of think that objectively it is a good thing. But many Americans weren't too happy about it. Partially because one of the things we observe in American history is that for the children of people born after a major conflict, it can be very difficult living in the shadow of the victorious generation that came before. You might remember when we talked about Henry Clay and John C. Calhoun and Daniel Webster, how they sort of lived in the shadow of the founders. And the fact that these were individuals that not only created a new country, but fought for that new country. And they sort of thought of them as demigods in their own lifetime. And you might also remember that having lived under the shadow of that generation, goes, I don't want to say a long way to explain, but a little ways to explain why those war hawks were all too eager to declare war on Britain in the year 1812. They had something to prove. They wanted to demonstrate their worthiness. Now, you could obviously make the case that maybe you should find, a hobby to demonstrate your worthiness. Pick up, I don't know, karaoke, maybe, or something. I mean, something that doesn't involve getting shot at and shooting at people, right? But that's not the way the 19th century mind works. And arguably, there are still some people today who believe that their way of demonstrating worthiness is to demonstrate that they have the courage to face fire, to face getting wounded or killed. So, again, if you're like me, you might think that's just okay. That the psychology here is interesting, but it's got to be more than that. And I would agree, which is why there are two other reasons. But let's take a look at probably the person who is more responsible for the Spanish-American War than any other individual, Theodore Roosevelt. This is the part of the course when Theodore Roosevelt comes like out of nowhere, punches you in the face, and basically drags you for a very long ride through American history up until, 1912 at the very least. So this is Theodore Roosevelt's debut. You'll be hearing of him a lot. Theodore Roosevelt was descended from a line of Dutch poltroons in Oyster Bay, New York. Theodore Roosevelt's grandfather, Cornelius Roosevelt, had made a fortune for the family by, one, buying up Manhattan property for dirt cheap prices after the Panic of 1837, and then later on being one of the first directors of the Chemical Bank, which you now know today as Chase Bank. So the Roosevelt family, it's fair to say, they were pretty loaded. Now, Roosevelt's father, Theodore Roosevelt Sr., if you hate being a junior, by the way, become President of the United States. Nobody knows him as Theodore Roosevelt Jr., by the way. The Roosevelt family was a very wealthy and very privileged family. And that includes all branches of the Roosevelt family, whether you're talking about the Oyster Bay Roosevelts, which included Theodore Sr. and his son, Theodore Jr., or the new upstart, vulgar Roosevelts, located at Hyde Park. These Roosevelts also had the peculiar misfortune of voting for Democrats in a state that was pretty solidly Republican during most presidential elections. But by the way, the Hyde Park Roosevelts would eventually sire one Franklin Delano Roosevelt as the head of that branch of the family. But right now, we're talking about the Oyster Bay Roosevelts. The other branch, I'm sure, won't do anything very important in the future. Now, Teddy Roosevelt's father, Theodore Sr., was a wealthy philanthropist who married one Martha Bullock of Georgia. Now, Martha Bullock, and the reason why I'm telling you where she's from is that, this is right before the Civil War, and that's kind of important because suddenly when the Civil War breaks out, the question is, who is going to demonstrate their courage and their devotion to the cause of preserving the Union? Well, not Theodore Sr. Theodore Sr. decides that he's not going to enlist, and he purchases a substitute, which is, again, totally legal, and was done often by men of his class and stature, but he does purchase a substitute. And after the war, that's looked at as a little suspect. Now, of course, in Theodore Sr.'s case, it was to preserve family unity. The Roosevelt family was, except for the Hyde Park Roosevelts, were Republicans who believed in the Union cause. And Theodore Sr. himself raised money for the Union and promoted the war effort, but he still got a substitute. And of course, Teddy Roosevelt's early childhood was shaped by the Civil War. we have records that he would regularly pray at night to God for the Confederate armies to be ground into dust. And this is while his mom is looking at and observing him, which must have been super awkward. And what was especially awkward is the fact that his uncles all joined the Confederacy and were actually fairly, and as far as war goes, they were kind of like Confederate pirates. They joined the Confederate Navy, served on raiding ships, and even though Teddy prayed for God to ground the Confederacy into dust, later on he would listen with unironic rapture as his uncles would sort of leave young Teddy spellbound at accounts of their stories during the war, which, by the way, is probably a really great sort of a nugget of truth of all the contradictions in post-war America. Now, that being said, the fact is that after the war, military service was heavily scrutinized. And almost all the major Republican politicians, especially in the 1870s and 1880s, had served in the Union Army to some degree, in some way, shape, or form. So, that being said, Theodore's father, Theodore Sr., was not the sort of person who would normally enter politics or be interested in politics. Gilded Age politics were very corrupt and very dirty. And we've talked about Boss Tweed and the fact that it's the era of machine politics, where generally politicians weren't selected because they came from good, well-known families. In fact, that was kind of a liability. If you came from a well-known, influential family, then that might give you power outside the party system. And so, generally, for the most part, politicians had to work their way up through the ranks, and whatever they got was because of the party, not because of, family ties. But sometimes politics in New York City in the Gilded Age could just get too dirty. And remember the story of Chester Arthur. Chester Arthur was sort of the most notorious embezzler of late 19th century American politics. And of course, the fact that he becomes president is something of a minor miracle, if Charles Guiteau can be considered divine intervention, and is super ironic as well, or maybe super appropriate. Well, what happens is that Theodore Sr. is appalled that Chester Arthur is bringing the city into such ill repute by essentially embezzling money from the Port Authority of New York. So it's decided that Theodore Sr. will be nominated to replace Chester Arthur. Then what happens, though, is that word gets out that Theodore Sr. did not serve in the army during the Civil War. And then, all of a sudden, his courage is called into account. He's branded and called a coward. And for young Teddy Roosevelt, who's in his late teens and early 20s when all of this is going down, this devastates him. Teddy Roosevelt's earliest memories involved his affliction with asthma. Despite the fact that Teddy Roosevelt eventually becomes kind of like this bounty hunter cowboy commando president, hipster Vladimir Putin, the fact is as a child, he was very frail and very sick. In fact, at some points during the night, he would just stop breathing because of his asthma. And at that point, his father would take young Teddy and put him in a carriage in the middle of the night and drive him around the city. And the idea being that cold air would flood into his lungs and he would begin to breathe again. To Teddy Roosevelt, his father, biologically and biographically, was the person who gave him life. And in his mind, his father could do no wrong. We know this because Theodore Roosevelt said as much. Let me read you the words of Theodore Roosevelt in my best, maybe passable Theodore Roosevelt voice. My father, Theodore Roosevelt, was the best man I ever knew. He combined strength and courage with gentleness, tenderness, and great unselfishness. I was fortunate enough in having a father whom I have always been able to regard as an ideal man. And then people accuse Theodore Sr. of cowardice. Now, Theodore Sr. develops a tumor, I think, in his intestinal tract, as Teddy is away at college. At this point, he's enrolled at Harvard. Theodore Sr. never tells Teddy of his condition. And so when Theodore Sr. suddenly dies when Teddy is still only about 20, Teddy assumes that his father has died of shame. Shame brought about by being publicly dubbed and branded by members of the Republican Party a coward. Some of you are wondering at this point why in the world we spent 8 minutes talking about the childhood and backstory of Theodore Roosevelt. There's 3 reasons. One is the fact that, much like Andrew Jackson, Theodore Roosevelt becomes, love him or hate him, one of those powerful presidents. And in order to understand how and why he wields power, we also have to kind of describe how his worldview is shaped. Second explanation is the fact that Theodore Roosevelt has a very combative relationship with other members of the Republican Party, and you can argue that it goes all the way back to this moment. 3, if we're trying to explain why there are some people like Teddy Roosevelt who almost have like this neurotic drive to demonstrate that they've got what it takes, that they have courage, it comes from this moment. Now, Teddy Roosevelt's backstory and life are idiosyncratic and unique to him. But that being said, you have a lot of other Americans going through a similar need, almost a neurotic need, to demonstrate that they too are worthy. And in Roosevelt's case, one of the last instructions that his father gave him was when he was in his teens. Teddy was a very bright student, very precocious, and did everything he could to sort of demonstrate his intellectual brilliance to his father. And at one point, his father said that, Teddy, you have perfected your mind, now you have to perfect your body. Basically, you get the impression that, Theodore Sr. was basically saying, get healthy. But in fact, Theodore Roosevelt becomes, or let's say takes that to kind of like an extreme. And even when he's elected president, spoiler, he's, boxing in the White House. He's, basically, again, hipster Vladimir Putin at this point. But unlike Putin, he's kind of the real deal. And it's all going back to that experience with his father. And you can, again, this is not necessarily the strongest possible argument, but I did say that Theodore Roosevelt was had more to do with America's declaration of war against Spain than maybe any other person to a certain extent. And also Theodore Roosevelt decided at a very early age that when it was his time to demonstrate his worth, his bravery, his determination, he was going to make the right decision. Reason 2, Spain and the United States are not exactly BFFs. And there's a few reasons for that. You can kind of point to the American Revolution, where Spain declares war on Great Britain, but they decide not to ally with the United States. thinking that the United States, once it becomes untethered from Great Britain, will become an expansionist power, and that expansion will come at the expense of Spain. Were they wrong? Well, if you look at the Mexican-American War in 1844 to 1846, it's kind of easy to see why the Spanish were so suspicious of the United States. Now, you could obviously say that, of course, Mexico was an independent country at this time. It was no longer New Spain. But on the other hand, the question is, if Mexico had not won its independence from Spain, would the United States and Spain have inevitably come to blows as American settlers moved further and further west? Again, it's a counterfactual. In other words, it's a what-if statement, so we can't really say for sure. But what we can say is that the United States found itself in conflict with a large segment of Spain's former colonial empire. And so maybe it was just a happy coincidence for the United States that by the time the U.S. and Mexico went to war, that Spain was no longer in the picture. But we can also point to things that predate American independence. You may remember that starting from the foundation of Jamestown, the Spanish were either seen with fear, terror, and paranoia, or open derision, because Spain was the dominant military power of the 1600s. Jamestown was built on a swamp to hide the city from Spanish fleets. And of course, we have the fact that in early American history, there was, constant skirmishing between Spanish-held Florida and the colonies of South Carolina and Georgia. But on the other hand, the Spanish colonies have also been kind of treated with a sense of derision. And this is to a certain extent because remember that the Spanish colonies have historically, their hierarchy has always been very different from the hierarchies we've seen in other colonies. Remember that Spain's colonies had a rigid caste system, but the caste system was based on a general acceptance of interracial marriages and interracial relationships. Most of the population of Mexico, for example, is descended from the mestizo caste, a caste that's composed of basically people who are descended from Europeans and Native Americans. Now, in fact, you kind of see that demography over most of Spain's current or former colonies, with maybe the exception being Cuba, which is, something we'll kind of come back to, interestingly. But many racially bigoted Americans kind of look down on the Spanish Empire as not being really European, whatever that means. Now, some of you are probably scratching your heads at this point, but remember that when we were talking about the argument for paternalism and racism, and that being a reason for the emergence of imperialism during this time period, it all sort of revolves around not just on this idea of European or white superiority, but the term that gets used quite a bit is Anglo-Saxon superiority. And generally Anglo-Saxon, depending upon how rigid or flexible you are with its definition, applies to basically people who are sort of associated with Great Britain, Germany, and, to a certain extent, the United States. But if we want to explain why the United States goes to war against Spain for being a mean empire, and then unironically jumps into Spain's shoes after kicking it out, this might be something useful to help us understand that. The other important reason is that it was seen as being pretty easy to do. So at this point, let's go ahead and have a pity party for Spain. Remember that, ironically, of all the countries we talked about during the Columbian Exchange, Spain was the most impressive. Spain manages to cobble together an empire in the Western Hemisphere larger than that of the Roman Empire in like a tenth of the time. Spain just has like this extraordinary, run in just over a generation or so, but then it kind of peaks. The analogy that I used year after year, and I think it still works, is that if any of you have seen Married with Children, Spain is the Al Bundy of colonial empires. And by that, maybe you're not going to meet this person at Greystone. At least I hope you don't. But most people are aware of that person whose life peaks during high school. Like junior and senior year is the culmination of their existence. And then it kind of goes downhill from there. That's not going to apply to any of you, right? But what happens is that eventually at reunions, if you guys even do reunions, because I feel like as an institution they've been made obsolete by social media, you meet that person who acts and talks and thinks exactly the way they did in high school. And there's nothing wrong with that in high school. But when you're in your 30s or 40s and, you're talking about your kids, where you've gone to school, where your career is going, and they're talking about that prank they pulled that they got suspended for, and they're laughing about it, it's just kind of sad. And that's kind of where Spain is. They haven't been suspended or anything, and they're not really playing pranks on anybody. It's just that their colonial empire peaks in the 15 and 1600s, and it's just been one long, tragic downward spiral since then. Spain has been gripped by foreign invasion from Napoleon, and also a few follow-up civil wars. Also, the fact that most of Spain's colonial empire declares independence in the late 18th and early 19th centuries doesn't help much either. So really, at this point, by the late 19th century, the only sizable possessions left in the Spanish colonial empire are Cuba and the Philippines. That's it. Those are really the last vestiges of an empire that spanned an entire globe. But here's why that's not the complete picture. So, the United States goes to war against Spain over the sustained objections of the President of the United States, the Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces. So, what gives? How can that actually happen? And so, the variable that's left, I think, is newspapers. When I say newspapers, I don't mean the sad, anemic bit of tissue paper that consists of all of 2 pages nowadays when you go to a convenience store or a grocery store. Newspapers were, in the 1890s, what television becomes in the 60s and 70s, and the internet is today. And they were big business. Like nowadays, newspapers don't know how to stay in business. And so basically what we're left with is these big urban newspapers that have been around since practically the dawn of time. Like there's the New York Times, there's the Washington Post, but even those major newspapers are still struggling with what it means to be a newspaper in the age of the internet. Now, if you're looking at our home state of North Carolina, we basically have 2 major newspapers that run daily or maybe every other day. There's the Charlotte Observer, and then there's the Raleigh News and Observer. But that's really it. And, the idea of publishing news on a daily basis is a difficult business model to sustain nowadays. On the other hand, if you look at the city of Philadelphia in the year 1890, a reasonably big city, but, certainly no New York or Chicago during this time period. The city of Philadelphia ran 10 newspapers daily. So what this meant is that there was enough stuff that was going on in Philadelphia so that 10 separate newspapers could actually make a living publishing news. Well, of course, there's another problem here. What's so darn interesting in Philadelphia? Well, I mean, I guess you could sort of get into, public policy discussions and, news stories on, what's going on in the state capitol, that kind of thing. But at some point, nobody wants to hear that. That doesn't sell. This is the kind of stuff that sells. tabloid fodder, cheating scandals, and of course stories that really can't be substantiated, so we're going to print them anyway. And all of those muckrakers that we talked about during the Progressive era, those journalists who are trying to expose corruption and business and politics and all that. I mean, yeah, people are reading them, I suppose, because they've got a big heart and they want to make a difference and all that. But also, it's just the sheer fact that you're able to kind of talk trash about people, or at least read trash about other people. You get to discover that these robber barons and politicians that seem so squeaky clean are in fact very much human, very human, in fact. Now, in the United States today, there's almost like this cottage industry that's grown up around discussing whether or not media, whatever media is biased, or should media be openly biased or openly supportive of, a particular policy or position, or should media endorse certain candidates? Should we strive for impartial news coverage? What does that even look like? There are all kinds of questions that we sort of have to ask ourselves whenever we're discussing standards in journalism. But as a historian, what I can tell you is that during this time period, there were no journalistic standards. And that's because journalism is a fairly new discipline during this time period. You want to be a journalist? Start writing and have something interesting to say. Maybe it's factual, maybe it's not. It's better if it is. Less likely to get sued for defamation or libel. But if it's not, well, oh well. We'll figure that out later. So journalism is, during this time period, especially during the Progressive era as a whole, openly endorses policies, positions, politicians, political parties, and of course, a lot of political parties or newspapers during this time period are named in such a way where you can tell what political party they support, like the Atlanta Democrat, for example. It's not just one of those things where you go, hey, that's a coincidence. Like, the newspaper is named after the Democrats. You have the Democratic Party. I'm sure their support of Democratic politicians is entirely coincidental. We also have to be very clear that the idea of non-sensationalist objective news is something that kind of emerges in the mid-20th century with the advent of TV-based news. You're not really going to see that in the era of newspapers. Now, a little discussion here. The term that usually gets mentioned in conjunction with the Spanish-American War is yellow journalism. And this is journalism that is based upon sensationalism and crude exaggeration. And some of you are probably thinking, well, what a coincidence. That also kind of describes a lot of news that and news coverage that I had seen. So what this tells you, by the way, is one, that the definition of yellow journalism isn't very helpful, because it's all journalism, to a certain extent, is based upon sensationalism and a certain degree of exaggeration, because news has to sell, especially in this Gilded Age world where we're seeing the revolutionary impact of capitalism. Now, the two major press barons, as they were called, were William Randolph Hearst of the New York Journal and Joseph Pulitzer of the New York World. And so, by the way, just think about that. You have Joseph Pulitzer of Pulitzer Prize fame, whose name is used for an award of journalistic integrity. And he was, kind of the lord of yellow journalism during this time period. Now, let's talk a little bit more in depth as to what yellow journalism actually means for the Spanish-American War. So remember, there's 10 newspapers in Philadelphia, and they're all competing with one another for the hottest scoop. So the question is, what happens if your domestic news dries up? Where else can you find a good, juicy news story? Especially news stories that are based upon what I like to call circle of life things. news. So we know that generally news based around life and death, including relationship scandals, they tend to sell really well because that seems to kind of hit us in, the types of things that we are developmentally programmed to be interesting in. Well, of course, speaking of the circle of life, death sells, especially in war. So fortunately for yellow journalism, and unfortunately for basically everybody else, there was a rebellion in Cuba against the Spanish government. So we have to kind of provide some context for that rebellion because, one, even though Cuba is a foreign, is a colony under control by the Spanish, we have to remember that Cuba is only 90 miles away from Florida. And because of its proximity to the United States, Cuba is heavily dependent upon the U.S. Yes, it is controlled by the Spanish crown. It is administered from the Iberian Peninsula, but economically, the United States is much more powerful and influential in Cuba, especially based upon the fact that Cuba grows sugar, and sugar. While it's certainly not as important as it used to be in the heyday of the 17th and 18th centuries, is still a very valuable commodity, as we saw in the case of Hawaii. So in 1894, what happens is that the price of sugar collapses, which in many cases forces Spanish farmers into poverty and famine. Part of that collapse was caused, by the way, because the United States increased tariffs, making it more difficult for Cuban farmers in Cuba. That's a little tautological or redundant. It basically forced Cuban farmers to lower their prices significantly, and this devastates the Cuban economy. So what happens is that, you have unemployment and you have a large number of people without very much to lose. Now, we should also point out that there have been other revolts in Cuban history up to this point. There was one, I think, as recently as the 1860s and 70s, and this is despite the fact, by the way, that many Cubans themselves were recent immigrants from the Iberian Peninsula. So what happens is that there is an insurrection against the Spanish government. And this insurrection was media savvy enough that some of its members actually cultivated ties with individuals like William Randolph Hearst, so that their story could kind of get more sympathetic treatment. Because the Cuban rebels themselves were sophisticated enough to know that realistically their only chance is for the United States to somehow get involved. Now, it's important to realize that even before the Spanish-American War, the United States has almost gotten involved with Cuba before. In 1854, we've got the Ostend Manifesto, in which the United States tries to annex Cuba, and is only prevented from doing so because of, once again, the old question of what's going to happen if Cuba becomes a U.S. territory. And remember, this is some 6 years before the outbreak of the American Civil War, and some 4 years after the Compromise of 1850, which certainly didn't do much to help sort of resolve those core disagreements. But now, once again, we have an example or, kind of a demonstration of how much things have changed since the end of the Civil War. What happens is that reporters take the short boat ride down to Cuba to report on what they observe in the conflict between Cuban rebels and the Spanish government. And the Cuban rebels themselves are kind of portrayed as plucky freedom fighters resisting an all-powerful tyrannical European overlord. In other words, many Americans, and certainly the newspaper reporters who write on the story, see the Cuban rebels as kind of a chip off the old block, right? I mean, it's kind of like watching your younger brother or your kid follow in your footsteps, right? And so there's this conscious linkage between the Cuban insurrection and the American Revolutionary War. Also, the extremes to which the Spanish military would go to suppress the insurrection also received lots and lots of coverage. You had the Spanish general in charge of basically fighting against the rebel movement was General Valeriano Weyler. And apparently, Weyler decides to place entire population centers in what is called reconcentrado centers. And reconcentrado, if you don't have to be, I think, in AP Spanish to understand what that word is related to. And of course, it is the concentration camp. We have to give this some context, though, because the concentration camp and the way we think of it was kind of developed by Nazi Germany. And of course, the concentration camp is this tool for genocide, at least in the way that the Nazis used it. Now, obviously, the Nazis were the only ones who used concentration camps in that way, but the concentration camp, at least in this point, is a little different. The concentration camp was used to basically relocate people away from villages. And the idea is that this would put pressure on rebels to lay down their weapons. It would also deprive rebels of their support from communities that might otherwise support them. Now, this is still not great. Let's be clear about that. But the goal here wasn't genocide. The goal wasn't to exterminate the Cuban people because, again, from the Spanish perspective, the Cuban people were Spanish subjects. But what makes this so controversial, beyond the linkage with Nazi concentration camps that come later, is the fact that concentration camps are still very deadly. No, the Spanish don't really intend to kill tens and thousands of Cubans, but the fact is that whenever you get large numbers of people in very close proximity to one another, where there's not great sanitation, and let's just say the Spanish don't exactly do a bang-up job catering the food, yeah, it kind of leads to problems. And many Cubans die of malnourishment and starvation. So you might not necessarily think that that is much of a moral conundrum, right? Cubans still die, whether it's death by intent or death by negligence is, kind of something you can discuss, and whether or not that in itself is important. But again, you have articles like this that are being reprinted in newspapers like the New York World, and public opinion starts to become inflamed. Now, all of this is happening around the year 1896, and you might remember that 1896 is a presidential election year, which pits Republican William McKinley against Democrat and kind of populist William Jennings Bryan. Now, McKinley openly endorses the idea of Cuban independence, or at least the Spanish negotiating with the Cuban rebels for some kind of withdrawal. And in 1896, Congress passes a resolution recognizing Cuban independence. In other words, the United States basically, or the U.S. Congress, doesn't recognize Spain's governance of the island as being legitimate anymore. And by the way, between two countries, that's a major league smack talk. Now, that being said, even though William McKinley is an expansionist, and even though he does want Spanish control of the island to end, he's also very cautious, because McKinley is one of the actually, I think he is the last president who's elected who has some memory of the Civil War as a soldier. McKinley himself is an ambulance driver, I think, during the Battle of Antietam. And if you remember, at the time, the Battle of Antietam was the bloodiest battle in American history. And McKinley himself is absolutely traumatized by what he observes and sees. And this kind of reflects, almost a generational gap between McKinley, who's sort of last of the old guard, and new politicians like Theodore Roosevelt, who is the face of the new guard. In other words, McKinley doesn't want war because he's seen war, he's gotten the t-shirt, and doesn't want to see it again. Theodore Roosevelt, however, never got that chance. He thinks that it's now his time to demonstrate his fitness, his worthiness. And so you kind of have like this generational divide over how Americans view war and view its use. Now, Theodore Roosevelt already had a reputation as being sort of a fiery but untamed rising star in the Republican Party. And he was apparently influential enough that when McKinley won the presidential election of 1896, Roosevelt got to bargain for a place into McKinley's cabinet. Now, what's interesting, though, is that Roosevelt decided that he wanted to be Assistant Secretary of the Navy. Now, just to give you guys some context, being a Secretary of the Navy, or even an Assistant Secretary of the Navy, is kind of a thankless position nowadays. You're basically the human resources officer of the Navy. It has very little real power or influence, which is why very few people want the job. Basically, very few good things come out of it. You don't really get much credit. And instead, if something goes wrong, you get a lot of blame. But the position was a little bit different in the 19th century, because being Secretary of War meant that you were basically the Secretary of the United States Army in peacetime. And generally your responsibilities consisted of making sure that troops on the western frontier were adequately provisioned and sort of, prepared. But the Navy Department, and being Secretary of the Navy, basically meant that you were supposed to be the top public official that manages wars between the United States and other great powers. Now, here's the thing, though. For the United States, the last time that the U.S. had gone to war against a peer adversary was the War of 1812, some, close to a century ago by this point. Okay, maybe like 88 years ago, I suppose, if we're being picky. But yeah, it doesn't really seem to be like a next good stepping stone, on the pathway to political power, I suppose. But Roosevelt wanted it, partially because Roosevelt was always fascinated by war, and naval warfare especially. When he was a student at Harvard University, he wrote a book, actually. I mean, not an assignment or anything, just like he had nothing better to do at Harvard, and he wrote a book that was a naval treatise that studied the naval war between the U.S. and Great Britain during the War of 1812. So it was something he was passionate about, but remember that Theodore Roosevelt was also an ardent imperialist and a jingoist. If you read the speech that you have to source, you can see that Roosevelt openly praises not just defensive war, but war itself. That war is a good thing. And so, as Assistant Secretary of the Navy, Roosevelt starts lobbying William McKinley to intervene. And apparently, this was a source of some amusement and annoyance to McKinley as public opinion began to sort of shift towards intervention. McKinley would get lobbied more and more by pro-war members of his cabinet. Roosevelt had formed a pretty close friendship with Leonard Wood, who also believed that the United States should intervene in the Cuban insurrection. And as luck would have it, Leonard Wood was also personal physician to William McKinley. So when Wood would go in and sort of take McKinley's blood pressure readings and all that, McKinley apparently had enough of a sense of humor to say, "So, have you and Theodore declared war on Spain yet?" And at that point would, without cracking a smile, would say, "No, Mr. President, but we think you should, and here's why." So McKinley is under pressure from not only members of his own cabinet, but also from Democrats who are using the ongoing insurrection in Cuba as a way to criticize McKinley. And of course, even the Spanish criticized McKinley. One of there was basically an ambassador in Cuba by the name of Dupuy de Lome. And de Lome was apparently wrote the Spanish government in Madrid the following letter about William McKinley. De Lome characterized McKinley as, quote, "weak and a bidder for the admiration who tries to leave a door open behind himself while keeping on good terms with the Jingos, or warmongers, of his own party." So basically, de Lome, this Spanish government minister based in Cuba, is kind of accusing McKinley of cowardice. Now, that being said, that's not a crime, because diplomats write frank and blunt assessments to their leadership all the time. It just never sees the light of day. But in those rare cases where there's a war going on, and sometimes letters disappear. So apparently, this letter that was bound for Spain was intercepted by Cuban rebels, who then gleefully presented it to one of the Hearst newspapers for publication. And apparently, the headline in response to the publication of this letter was, quote, "the worst insult to the United States in its history." I'm not even sure that's the worst insult to William McKinley in his history, let alone to the United States, but that just kind of shows how sensationalistic some of these newspapers could actually be. It's also worth noting that de Lome probably had some backers within McKinley's own administration, at least in terms of people who agreed with him. Theodore Roosevelt, around this time period, characterized William McKinley as having, quote, "no more backbone than a chocolate eclair." And you have to think of what a chocolate eclair is. It's kind of gushy and doesn't really have any structure to it. So yeah, even Roosevelt is thinking of McKinley as almost being a coward, or at least being very, very reluctant. So around this time period, in February 9th of 1896, the USS Maine docks in Havana Harbor. So I goofed. It's actually 1898, not 1896, when the Maine is actually sent to Havana. Speaking of goofs, let's talk more about the Maine. So I'm sure it's just a coincidence that this brand spanking new U.S. warship is sent to dock in the largest city and port in all of Cuba, in the middle of an ongoing diplomatic crisis that doesn't really show any sign of resolving itself. Now, that being said, countries send warships to make social calls all the time. There's nothing untoward about it. The McKinley administration says that this is a regularly scheduled visit. But the fact that the USS Maine is a modern warship, it's actually only about like 8 or 9 years old at this point, and the fact that it is located now in the center of Spanish-controlled Cuba, and the fact that it also outclasses any other Spanish warship in the area might be intended to send a message. We also have to kind of point out the fact that the Maine was sent not just to make a social call, but also to assure the large number of U.S. citizens on the island that if the crisis continued to escalate and war broke out, that the United States Navy would basically be able to intervene. But none of that would be of any importance whatsoever if not for one critical fact. That is, on the night of February 15th, 1898, the USS Maine mysteriously explodes in Havana Harbor. Now, this looks kind of sketch, and admittedly, I think it objectively is kind of sketchy. The fact that the United States Maine blows up mysteriously during a diplomatic spat with Spain just seems a little too convenient, doesn't it? And of course, that's what the newspapers eagerly reported, that the USS Maine was the result of some kind of attack or provocation by the Spanish government. And I don't think that you need to be a yellow journalist necessarily to make that conclusion. Now, sometimes reality is actually stranger than fiction, and this is one of those times, because the U.S. Navy, some 70 years after the fact, actually ordered a formal investigation into the reason why the Maine sunk. And as best they can figure it, it wasn't because of a Spanish mine or torpedo. It was actually a result of improper safety procedures. Yes, so the USS Maine was an inside job because it blew up from the inside. But that wasn't exactly known to people at the time. So in response to all this, William McKinley is forced to respond to not just Spanish provocations, but provocations from Republicans and Democrats by blockading the island of Cuba. Also, Congress passes the Teller Amendment on April 20th of 1898, which says that, well, we're not going to take over Cuba, but if we kind of do, we're not going to officially annex it. And at this point, William McKinley threatens to sign this into law unless the Spanish government immediately ceases hostilities. Well, from Spain's perspective, they're simply fighting a war in their own territory. Like, who died and made the United States mom? What happens is that as the blockade continues, the Spanish are now fed up, and they declare war on the United States on April 24th of 1898. And so begins the Spanish-American War. So the question is, where is the first battle going to be fought in the Spanish-American War? Was that 3 a.m.? Did you say Cuba by chance? You think Cuba because Cuba is closest to the United States, maybe, because the United States has economic interest there, and of course the yellow journalists have been following the story of the Cuban Rebellion, and of course there's a lot of public sympathy for those rebels, right? That's why you think it's fought in Cuba, right? Well, that's good, outstanding reasoning, which is why it's fought in the Philippines. And at this point, you might be thinking, what the heck? And you should be thinking, what the heck? But just like we talked about with the USS Maine, sometimes reality is stranger than fiction, and this is one of those times. So, back to Teddy Roosevelt. So, Teddy Roosevelt is Assistant Secretary of the Navy, which, again, usually is not necessarily the most prestigious job. Well, Roosevelt's boss wasn't really interested in the complexities of managing a modern Navy. And the Secretary of the Navy would regularly take trips back to his home state of Massachusetts, leaving Theodore Roosevelt more or less to run the Navy Department. Well, apparently, Roosevelt orders the commander of the United States Pacific Squadron, based in Hong Kong, to set sail for the Philippines after the destruction of the USS Maine. Now, he doesn't do that with any orders to do so. Roosevelt is literally just making this call once his boss leaves the office. But as it happens, only a little week after hostilities only a week after the destruction of the Maine, hostilities with Spain break out, and suddenly, once war is actually declared by the Spanish, the U.S. Navy is right smack dab in the middle of Manila Harbor. And the result is what some might call a turkey shoot, where Admiral George "That Stash" Dewey manages to annihilate the Spanish Navy with basically just like 1 or 2 people killed and injured on the U.S. side. It's just like one of those one-sided slaughter fests. And this is something that is important, actually, about the Spanish-American War, because some people in the Spanish-American War sort of assume or interpret that modern war does not have to be bloody, that modern warfare can be fought with technological precision in order to minimize casualties. And that sort of American approach to conflict, that, superior technology can enable you to fight a clean and bloodless war, at least, on the part of Americans, that appears not infrequently in American history. We saw this during the first Gulf War. In fact, that same kind of mentality. And sometimes, that mentality can kind of be dangerous because it allows us to assume that war can be something that it's not. And because of what happens in the very beginning of the Spanish-American War, Americans assume that war doesn't have to be that bad, that maybe war is actually easy. And it leads us into maybe some false assumptions about what war is really like a little bit later in the conflict. Anyway, though, once Theodore Roosevelt orders the fleet to Manila Bay, he resigns as Assistant Secretary of the Navy. And it's not because he feels like any sense of responsibility or that he feels like he's overstepped the office. No, he resigns from the Navy Department to enlist as a common soldier in the Army. Now, this would sort of be like if, when I was sort of growing up, we had the Iraq War, which is probably the most recent time period where the United States military is seriously committed to a major conventional fight. It would have been like Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld ordering the troops into battle, but then resigning from the army, from the cabinet, and then enlisting in the army as a grunt. That doesn't happen. In fact, everybody said, including members of Roosevelt's own family, that his political career was now over. And Roosevelt's okay with that. Because in his mind, it's not about the politics. It's personal, actually. It's about demonstrating that you can stand and take fire and look danger in the eyes and come out on top. That's what it's about. So Roosevelt decides that he wants to be part of this war that he himself helped create. The actual war is fairly short. As soon as the United States Navy destroys the Spanish fleet in Manila Bay, U.S. forces help support Filipino rebels in occupying the country and ejecting the Spanish garrison. Now, what's also really interesting is the fact that it is let's say that U.S. forces in the Philippines quickly learned something that was totally unexpected. The United States knew almost in intimate detail that there was a Cuban insurrection ongoing at the time. What took Americans completely by surprise, though, was that there was another rebellion against Spain in the Philippines led by Emilio Aguinaldo. And arguably, this rebellion was much larger and much deadlier than its Cuban counterpart. We'll talk a little bit more about them in just a little bit, because let's say that this shock that came from, first introductions, let's just say was not an auspicious start. And relations between the United States and the Filipino rebels go from bad to worse as the fighting continues. But anyway, Soon after the United States declares war, U.S. troops are sent overseas to Cuba. Now, the Spanish-American War is for the most part a naval conflict in which America's industrial technology really begins to shine. U.S. warships are modern, using the latest technology. Almost all of them have steel-plated hulls and just make mincemeat of their Spanish counterparts. On the other hand, the ground war was a bit of a slog. And it's a bit of a slog partially because, again, the United States has not really had a major war of this size since at least the American Civil War. And so it takes a while for troops to actually get deployed. Once they're actually mobilized and sent to Florida, because of course Florida is geographically closest to Cuba, they just kind of sit there for a while. And many troops actually take casualties from tropical diseases before they actually reach the front lines. Now, again, the United States is able to quickly gain naval superiority in the Caribbean Sea. But it does have to launch a ground campaign to finally eject Spanish forces from Cuba. Now, this is where Theodore Roosevelt comes in, because Theodore Roosevelt, of course, couldn't just be a private soldier. He had to do something more dramatic and more interesting. Theodore Roosevelt's daughter, Alice, said this of her father: "My father had to be the bride at every wedding and the corpse at every funeral. He had to be the center of attention. And by the way, he knew he was the center of attention. And so he was very good at getting the media to follow him around at whatever or with whatever he was doing." So Roosevelt decided to organize a unit of volunteer forces called the Rough Riders. But the name doesn't even do it justice. The Rough Riders were composed of basically people in Theodore Roosevelt's social circle. But that's a pretty big circle when you consider just how traveled he was, or how well traveled he was. The Rough Riders consisted of alumni from Harvard University, where Roosevelt went to school, consisted of childhood friends and acquaintances. It consisted of cowboys and Native Americans that he had met in the West. It was almost like a circus act, but it wasn't the circus, it was a military outfit. And Roosevelt was their leader, though in effect, in reality, he was given a kind of a handler, Colonel Leonard Wood, who was McKinley's surgeon. He sort of helped Roosevelt run the unit. So in the ground war in Cuba, Roosevelt's forces get ambushed. I'm not sure what this says about Teddy Roosevelt, but instead of moving away from the ambush, he charges right into it, which, by the way, is actually what you're supposed to do. But Roosevelt charges up Kettle Hill, not San Juan Hill, by the way, but Kettle Hill. But he's able to basically rout entrenched Spanish defenders with the help of a number of military units. And in doing so, he's able to effectively force what remains of the Spanish fleet to make one last futile attack against the United States Navy before it's just destroyed. And that basically ends the Spanish-American War, at least this phase of it. And Roosevelt himself covers himself in glory. And eventually he's awarded a Medal of Honor for not just demonstrating a willingness to fight, but actually, successfully fighting. We should also mention that while Roosevelt doesn't become like a victorious war general, he's not that high, by the way, he is able to use that military success in his political career. Because even though most people assume that Roosevelt's political career is now over, his fame that he earns at the Battle of San Juan Hill enables him to return to his home state of New York, where he is eventually elected governor of the state. And if you remember, late 19th century, early 20th century politics, becoming governor of New York is not a bad springboard if you have even greater ambitions, like ambitions for the presidency. So eventually, Spain is forced to seek terms. And this leads to yet another Treaty of Paris. Come on, diplomats, you're killing us here. Pick another city. Just, Vienna is nice. London is nice when it's not rainy and moldy. It doesn't have to be Paris. Do you know what you might be saving the world, but do you know what you're doing to high school students? Anyway, so this treaty results in the United States annexing Puerto Rico, the Philippines, and Guam. And of course, the United States still maintains control of Puerto Rico and Guam. The Philippines is granted independence on July 4th of 1946. Spain does give independence to Cuba, and this actually destroys the last remnant of the Spanish Empire. So in some respects, it's kind of a shocking bookend to the course. Like, we began the course with the emergence of the Spanish Empire, and the Spanish Empire is eventually destroyed by the country that we're studying for the entire year, the United States. The annexation of the Philippines demonstrates that this wasn't just a war to liberate the poor, downtrodden rebels of Cuba. And so McKinley and many of his Republican allies realize that they want to annex the Philippines. But he has to tour the country to kind of pick up on how people are feeling, because the idea of the United States becoming an overseas empire has, incredibly deep political ramifications. It, impacts the very image of who we are as a nation, because, again, we were birthed as basically an anti-imperialist country, a country that fights against empires. It doesn't become an empire until now, actually. And apparently when McKinley would go on these tours, he would sort of pretend like he was speaking to himself, and he would say, well, come on, guys, should we give him back to Spain? And of course, the crowd would say no, until at last, he almost acts like he's forced to accept the annexation of the Philippines. And here are the words of William McKinley on that annexation. Don't know what he sounds like, so I'm just going to wing it. Quote, "We could not give them back to Spain. That would be cowardly and dishonorable. That we could not turn them over to France or Germany, our commercial rivals in the Orient, that would be bad for business and discreditable. 3, that we could not leave them to themselves. They were unfit for self-government, and they would soon have anarchy and misrule over there worse than Spain's was." By the way, note that paternalism argument sort of seeping in. And 4, that there was nothing left for us to do but to take them all and to educate the Filipinos and uplift them and civilize and Christianize them, and by God's grace do the very best we could do by them as our fellow men for whom Christ also died. And then I went to bed and went to sleep and slept soundly. Of course, when you advertise the fact that you slept soundly and have no worries about something, it probably means that you actually have worries about this thing. Also, we have to point out to Mr. McKinley that actually 85% of the Filipino population was Christian. They were just Roman Catholic, and I suppose to William McKinley that doesn't count for some reason. Believe it or not, the Treaty of Paris is almost not ratified by the Senate, because remember, the Senate has to ratify treaties for them to take effect. But the treaty also annexed the Philippines. And at this point, Congress wasn't really sure if it wanted to go that far. And finally, what happens is that events kind of force Congress's hand to a certain extent. What happens is there is a skirmish that breaks out between the U.S. Army in the Philippines and Filipino rebels. There is sort of a checkpoint that's guarded by U.S. Army units. A Filipino rebel approaches the checkpoint. The soldier orders the Filipino to stop, and the Filipino doesn't. It's almost like he doesn't speak English or something. But eventually, after repeated demands for the Filipino to stop, the U.S. soldier opens fire, and outrage over the death of this Filipino leads to a broader confrontation between the United States and the Philippines. Now, here is the irony of ironies, the tragic irony, actually. I said that the Spanish-American War sort of provides the United States the image, the dream of a short, victorious war fought by technology. What happens, though, is they do get a short and victorious war against the Spanish. But because of what they do to the Spanish, they get a long, bloody, and horrible war with the Filipino people. This war will actually last until 1902. Something like 4,300 Americans are killed, but this is dwarfed by the 16 to 20,000 Filipino rebels who are killed, and that's not even counting the 250,000 to 1 million people who are, we're not really even sure what the exact number is, but somewhere between 250,000 to 1 million people die, mostly from malnutrition and famine caused by the conflict itself. Now remember, the United States goes to war against Spain based upon the argument that the Spanish are mistreating the Cuban people because Spanish policy resorted in something like 150 to 400,000 people dying in those concentrado camps. So, it doesn't look good. And what eventually happens is that the United States Senate reluctantly and narrowly ratifies the Treaty of Paris, more out of solidarity with the U.S. military than a genuine desire to annex the Philippines. If you thought that the United States becoming an empire was as easy as flipping a light switch, well, then you're wrong, because actually opposition to the Treaty of Paris and just the idea of annexing overseas territory was incredibly controversial. Yeah, I suppose there's some precedent for it that we talked about, Hawaii, American Samoa, etc., but nothing quite like this, though. So you have the formation of the American Imperialist League, which is exactly what it sounds like, as an organization that objects to the expansion of the United States into a major overseas empire. And it really kind of attracts a strange, interesting mixture of different characters. It almost sounds like the lead up to a joke of, so-and-so and so-and-so and so-and-so walks into a bar. Well, so Samuel Gompers, Andrew Carnegie, William Randolph Hearst, Jane Addams, and William James walk into a bar, and they form the American Anti-Imperialist League. But William Randolph Hearst, the guy whose newspapers did so much to start the war, decides that he was only interested in the war itself, not the consequences of the war. But some of the language used was really powerful. Psychologist and intellectual William James says that, quote, the drive for imperialism had caused the nation to puke up its ancient soul. So, kind of nauseating, but still really powerful stuff. So you have opposition to the idea of imperialism because of, political idealism, the idea that somehow the United States is betraying its roots. But also some of the opposition to imperialism, though, was ironically enough rooted in chauvinism and racism. Many supporters of the Populist Party, which, if you remember, was an anti-immigrant party, were suspicious of the whole idea of going out and administering and supervising non-white populations. Also, by the way, things had kind of fallen out with the Cuban rebels. part of the reason there is that it was discovered that many of the Cuban rebels themselves weren't white, but African American, well, actually just descendants of African slaves in Cuba. Now, the United States never annexes Cuba, but that being said, it does have continued power and influence in Cuba. And not just the fact that American business elites are so essential to the Cuban economy. The Platt Amendment is passed by Congress, which guarantees Cuban independence, but it basically allows the United States to sort of maintain a presence in Cuba, both figuratively and literally. The most literal example of this is the fact that the United States takes land in what is now Guantanamo Bay, Cuba, for use as a naval base. And the U.S. has been there ever since. Not only does the Spanish-American War create the American empire, it also creates the political career of maybe the most important or one of the most important politicians in American history. And so next time, fresh from his success in Cuba, we will talk about, quote, the damned cowboy himself, Theodore Roosevelt. Until next time.